Okay, we're going to take a look at William Cullen Bryant's Thanatopsis. This will probably be the shortest or smallest section of your unit test later on since we're not covering it in class. Wanted to show you how the brief fitting of this into the Romantic time period, that it is going to be a nature style of poem and kind of the exact opposite of what you would see with somebody like Edgar Allan Poe, but still fits into the Romantic time period. You'll probably want to take a few outline notes on this, and I'll give you a few hints as far as test questions along the way as you go through this. First of all, the title of Thanatopsis comes from two of the Greek words that help us see Bryant's view of death. The word thanatos, which means death by itself, and also the word opsis, where we're kind of got a play on optical there, which is the word view. So it is Bryant's view of death in this poem. As he goes through these 80 some odd lines of poetry, it's not only a matter of his view of death, but advice to the readers and the audience of his poem as how they should also view death as well. First 10 lines are kind of like a separate section of the poem. They're going to introduce a particular character as far as the main character in the poem. And then after the 10 lines are over, the perspective is going to change where it's more of advice being given by this character to people like us who read the poet's words to see how we should view death as well. The character being introduced is someone who is completely enthralled and loves nature the way things are, sees all what they call the visible forms or the objects of nature, and feels like there's a very strong connection. One of the key words here to mark is the word communion. It's not like a religious version of communion like we would see with the Lord's Supper, but the idea of having that communal nature where strong connection and tie-in with the environment in which they find themselves. That description alone definitely fits into the characteristics of Romanticism. And if you were using this poem as an example of one of your short answer questions, the idea that Bryant does have a character tying strongly into nature would be a good example to mention on a short answer question, identifying some work as being romantic. Now, the narrator's character has two reactions or has two uses of nature basically at this point. When things are going real well in happier times, they feel like nature is actually rejoicing with them. But when things aren't going so well, nature is there as a source of comfort. As I mentioned a second ago, line 10 is an important line number for you to remember because this is where the perspective of the poem changes from that person that's being described, that character being described, to you as the reader and the audience of the poem, showing how we should view death and also view our own lives. The next 20 lines give you an idea about the first and original view of death. If you're thinking about dying and that kind of depresses you, which it naturally probably would, then the narrator and character's main piece of advice is for you to go outside and get around nature and help nature teach you how to cope and understand the things about death that may be depressing you or confusing you at sometimes. It's not necessarily an escapist attitude, but the idea that nature has the solution provided by being able to comfort you and remind you of how beautiful and natural everything is, that God has presented this place for you, and that if God is the one presenting the information or the place for you, then naturally it would be a comforting spot to be. The second bullet point here is one you probably want to make sure you mark as well. The image of nature being shown as a calm voice. That's the key phrase to remember. And that voice is the one doing the reminding that we're not going to be here very long on this earth and our days are numbered and that we should be able to enjoy them in this natural setting as much as possible. And then also at the end of this, or toward the end of this 20 line segment, it's a reminder that when we all die, we are going back to the earth with the idea of ashes to ashes and dust to dust. At the end of this 20 line segment, as we do return to the earth, the poet William Cullen Bryant mentions that these three things are going to happen to us or to our bodies as we go back to the earth. We're going to mix with all the elements and become like rocks. That doesn't sound very pleasing, but it is the natural progression of life, returning back to the earth. And we're going to be like clumps of dirt that the country folks eventually are going to walk over and plow over on their farms, and that our decaying bodies will be a source of food for all the oak trees whose roots are going to pierce us while we're in the ground. It's not exactly the most pleasing or beautiful image of death and what happens to us, but what Brian is trying to get across here is the natural progression of things. This is the way it always is. He's not trying to say there's no afterlife or anything like that, but just simply this is what's going to happen to our physical bodies once we pass away. Key point for you to mark in your notes here is a turning point in the poem is line 31, and that turning point occurs with the word yet. In other words, here's one way that I've shown you how to view death and what death is like physically, but now we want to see that there's an alternative or a extra piece of information that hasn't been told yet. So all of what has been said in the first 30 lines is true, yet there is an extra piece of information that you want to take care of. The poet says here, while we will be going to an eternal place after we die, we're not going to be going alone. That's probably the strongest sense of comfort that he could offer at this point, that things are going to go well for us as long as we've lived a good life, and we're not going to be going to our eternal places by ourselves. Our loved ones and our company and our family can always be with us at one point. And the key here to mark in your notes is also the third bullet point, that it's in this section of 15 lines where the death images change from this creepy, weird, and scary to a more comfortable section of lines at this point. Because we're going to be, once we die, even in the presence of people who have died before us who were powerful, like kings and all the other beautiful people, and especially those who are wise at this point. Closing out that section in lines 37 through 45, just a reminder about how nature is used or viewed by the poet William Cullen Bryant. He takes a moment in these 7 or 8 lines to describe the hills, the valleys, the woods, the rivers, the meadows, and all the oceans around, but it's simply done as a reminder that these are simply decorations on our tomb, and the earth and the ground itself is going to be our own tomb. And so to have the most beautiful tomb around is kind of a desired quality of life, but you would never forget that all these things God has placed into the environment are simply there to decorate our tombs once we're dead, but for also us to enjoy while we're alive. Going to the next section, a fairly short section here of about 11 lines. In this section, no matter where you look on the earth, the poet is telling you there are people who have died there, and there's people who are going to continue to die there, and it's the idea of the cycle and the circle of life going on, that no matter what happens, there's going to be death in every section of the globe, and there's really no way to avoid or to get around that. And the key part to remember and mark in your notes here is that this is done as an image of showing that the earth is one really large tomb for all of mankind. Going on to the next section, there's a question that is asked by the poet about what's going to happen if you die and nobody notices. It's kind of been compared over the years as the idea of a tree falls in the woods and no one's around, does it actually make a sound? Well, Bryant is going after the point that we shouldn't worry if we die and nobody cares that we're dead, because it's a matter of the people who are behind once we're still alive, or once we're dead and gone, they're still alive. And even if they don't notice that you're gone, they're going to follow you in death as well. That eventually everyone ends up in the same place and we all pass away. And we all still have those decorations on our tombs described by the settings in nature. And the ones who bury us are then going to follow those people and be buried by someone else as well. So the cycle continues to repeat. Not something to be afraid of, not something to be very comforting necessarily, but just a benefit that's or a quality that's going to take place no matter what we do. It's unavoidable. Getting into the last 15 lines or so of the poem, there are reminders once again about the cycle of life continuing. The 2 indented bullet points would be important examples to remember along the way, that people of all ages are going to die. It could be kids, it could be teenagers, it could be young adults, senior citizens, no matter the case, people of all ages still experience this death that's unavoidable. And it doesn't matter when it takes place, because there's 2 things about death that are always true, and these are the ones that are marked in all caps at the bottom of the screen here, that the reality of death and the certainty of death is a recurring statement and theme of the work, that it's going to happen, it's unavoidable, but there is some comfort in what happens after you're passed away. Last couple of slides here, looking at the end of the poem. So the question is going to be asked, well, what are we supposed to do? And what would William Cullen Bryant want us to do as far as understanding this idea of death? His answer would be found in line 74. That would be an important line number to remember later on. His suggestion is, well, we might as well go ahead and just live if our life is going to be passed away anyway. We might as well enjoy the time that we have here and not be afraid of death. Some people can worry themselves into the grave naturally, and we don't want that to happen. The other thing I'd want you to mark on this slide is the last question is, why should you be afraid of something that you already know everything about and can't avoid? So William Cullen Bryant takes this opportunity in the poem to describe what death is going to be like, what happens to us physically, and then what's going to happen to us after our passing away. So why be afraid of that? Closing slide here for you at the end of this presentation is the last reminder in the last 8 or 9 lines of the poem. This is the final advice given to us by William Cullen Bryant. He would want us to go into death trusting that what is happening to us is a good thing, and perhaps even more importantly than that, it is a natural process. It's a part of what nature and part of the environment, part of what God intended, that this cycle naturally is going to take place. He's not trying to be overly religious at this point, and he's not trying to say who you should trust or what you should trust in during this time, but just the idea that this is going to happen to you. It's not a bad thing. Everyone goes through it, and we have to kind of embrace the fact that this is part of our reality. But as far as ending the poem on an upbeat note, he does have this one closing image that of someone who accepts death as being wrapped up in a blanket and preparing for a dream-filled sleep. So not a violent, not an awful, not an ugly death, but a way of just kind of accepting the comfort of what's going on and going into that reality and the certainty of death. So hopefully this short presentation will help you with the study guide. Once again, this will be one of the shortest sections on the unit test itself, but knowing the basic tie-in of how this poem fits into Romanticism would be your best bet.